Dr. Warren Vander Hill interviewing Dr. Donald Smith for the Ball State Oral History Project. It's February 7, 2005. Dr. Smith is Emeritus Dean of the College of Applied Sciences and Technology and Professor of Industry and Technology. Don, I want to thank you for your willingness to assist me with my oral history project. The first question I've asked all of my interviewees is if they would tell me a little bit about their background, where they're from, where they got their education, and essentially get me from back there in the recesses of time to the big decision to come to Ball State.
Okay, well, I'm glad to do that. I grew up in not too far away in central Ohio. Until the time I learned of a job at Ball State, I had no idea where Ball State was located, but I grew up on a farm, was talked into going to college by a counselor who said that you could always go back and become a building contractor if that's what you want to do if things don't work out in college. So never became a building contractor, but I dabbled around a little with that. But things were successful in college. I went to Wilmington College in southern Ohio, which had a work-study program, and it's not work-study in the sense of the federal government's work-study program. It was just the same name, but it allowed someone with essentially no money to go to a fairly expensive school. It's a sister school to Earlham. It costs quite as much as Earlham probably, but it's a Quaker school. Had a very good experience there. At Wilmington, my major in industrial education, which was my love, and it was close to building contracting possibly. From the time I graduated, or at the time I was ready to graduate there, I had offers of 2 assistantships, one at Ohio University and one at Kent State. I took the one at Kent State and worked there with an advisor who was very interested in curriculum development, curriculum change, and changing the field of industrial education to be a study of technology, something that was really liberal education or general education, depending on who's trying to describe that. Right, yeah. That was a very inspiring experience for me, and I knew that I wanted to be a part of that. After my assistantship, I taught in public schools for 8 years in the Cleveland area and was able to develop some innovative new programs that received a lot of national publicity, and I was able to speak at national conferences as a public school teacher, which was exciting to me.
This is one of the suburbs or the Cleveland City School?
It was not Cleveland City. It was first a small town outside of Kent, and then a school outside of Cleveland on the east side. It was the Orange school system. When I was hired there, the superintendent was very interested in having somebody that would develop an innovative program. He had about the second or third middle school, brand new, beautiful middle school when that concept came out in the country. And the first one was in, I believe it was Pontiac, Michigan, or Pontiac, Michigan, I believe. And we were about the third, and it was a beautiful place to showcase a new program. And he didn't know what he wanted, but he didn't want anything like he'd ever seen in the public schools. So I gave him that, and that was a part of the publicity. I was able to generate and visitors coming from throughout the country. Well, that resulted in probably the biggest innovator at the university in curriculum development, who at the time is now deceased, but was at the University of Maryland. And he offered me a EPDA fellowship to come there and work on a doctoral degree and continue developing curriculum.
What is EPDA?
Educational Professional Development Act, which was a government program to educate future college professors, basically. And it was well supported financially. We were able to live on that stipend for a year, and actually we spent 3 years there. But the EPDA fellowship was for 1 year, and that got me off to a good start. Full-time student, no duties, and So that was nice. I met some good people, including Tom Wright, who's an emeritus professor, former distinguished professor at Ball State, who, in one aspect of this curriculum development thing we were doing, he had been doing the same thing and developing a new program to prepare teachers, a course at Ball State University. And a position opened up here, and saw an opportunity to be able to work with Tom.
Oh, okay.
And we had a particular area that I was interested in and had developed the most was in manufacturing and teaching the concepts of manufacturing. He was doing that. It was almost a mirror image of what I'd been doing in a middle school with what he was preparing teachers to do. And we didn't know each other at all until we met years after we both started developing this. So that's how I got to Ball State. And
so you were really, this is kind of atypical, I might add, of people I've interviewed. So you really were drawn here by your previous contact with a person, Tom Wright, who was already on the faculty.
That's correct. He was doing his doctoral degree while on the faculty here and was going out there in the summers. And the year that I went there in '69 with the EPDA fellowship, he was doing his year of residency.
Oh, okay.
So we were there together a year
Yeah.
and in a couple of classes together, and we're talking about the things we've done and couldn't believe the similarities.
Yeah. Huh.
So
A tenure line position opened up at Ball State, and
Right.
you applied for that.
right.
And we'll assume that Tom had something to do with the selection process. Is that fair?
I think that's probably fair. Tom is
Yeah, right.
tends to want to get what
Yes,
he wants.
we know Tom.
And he usually does.
Well, when you accepted the position, now having had a high school background, now you're coming to a university, what were your expectations of the role of a faculty member at Ball State? What were you expected to do?
Well, I guess I was probably relatively naive, and that fit in well with what was happening at Ball State in '72. There weren't the expectations of scholarly productivity that there are today,
Right.
and not that that was right and it's wrong now,
Right.
not at all. We're developing the university,
Yeah.
and that's just where the university was at the time. It was a good time for me to come because I had a
Right.
little more time to kind of work into that without some of the pressures that I think are on people today.
Well, be a little more specific. When you came here, who was the department head?
William Sargent, William
Okay.
T. Sargent.
William T. Sargent's the department head. And what did he tell you you were expected to do?
Teach 12 hours,
Okay.
quarter hours.
Right.
And they liked the fact that I'd already done presenting at national
Oh, okay.
meetings. That was very important, and I've been active, or was becoming active with state, in fact, I gave up the presidency of Northeast Ohio Industrial Education Association to go to Maryland, so I was already active there. They thought that was great, and I think they were looking at the professionalism and the,
Okay.
being active, continuing a reputation that had been developed by that department nationally here. There were individuals that were beginning to make a pretty good name for this department at Ball State, and there definitely was more emphasis on the professional activities, speaking, being involved with committees, being involved as officers of state and national organizations.
Okay.
More emphasis there than on scholarly productivity.
Okay.
That came along. I guess that was the pressure was coming on that about the time that I became department
Yeah,
chair.
we'll get to that in a minute. That's called Jim Cook's Revolution, the early 1980s and the mid 1980s.
Yes.
So to sum up that part of your career at Ball State, you're a faculty member. The expectation is that you're going to be a very fine teacher. I'm assuming that.
Right.
And that you're going to be visible in your professional organization. Because I think the latter point about being visible in your professional organization is not that standard across the entire campus at that point. I think that you're talking about a department that really seemed to be concerned about you and your colleagues on the faculty being involved both locally, but even more importantly, perhaps the state level, regional level, national level.
Right. That's exactly right.
Okay.
And they helped as much as they could with travel, but that was minimal.
Okay.
You know, there was sort of an allotment per faculty member,
Yeah.
only a little bit more if some didn't go, which some others that were more active would get a little bit. But we didn't look at it, of course, hotels weren't as expensive and travel wasn't as expensive, and we just, coming out of public school and the way things had been, we didn't expect that we were going to get a lot of travel money.
Okay.
And we just bite the bullet and
Yeah.
got there. And
Okay. Were you then, as a faculty member, promoted from assistant to associate and associate to full professor?
yes, I was.
I made the statement in a kind of cover note to the series of interviews that most of the way which people assess their colleagues for tenure and for promotion to the senior ranks at that point in Ball State's history really had to do with one being viewed as a good colleague. That compared to what you ended up overseeing as a chair and a dean, there really wasn't, at least in my department, the history department, any systematic way of collecting data about whether or not you were a good teacher or not. It was just, I mean, my view is it was more word of mouth, rather than at this point in your career, systematically collecting student evaluations, because I don't think most departments did systematic collection of student evaluations at that time. Is that true of industry and technology?
I frankly can't remember a time that I wasn't doing it, but I don't know whether I was doing it as voluntarily or whether it was being required.
Okay.
It was much later that it was required for
Okay.
P&T review.
Yeah, right.
I do know that you were told how much you were, or how many
Right.
you were going to have, classes you were going to have to do. I just routinely did them, and I think I did it from the beginning on all classes I taught, but I can't.
You don't recall whether you had
Sure.
to turn them in, though, for tenure review and promotion consideration?
Well, I think I put them in.
Okay. But the whole department
because-
didn't require that, or did they?
I don't think, probably not early.
Okay.
I'm not, that would have been 72.
Yeah.
I became department chair in 82, and by that time it was...
Change was on the horizon.
Oh, yes.
Well, when you came here, even though you had this terrific working relationship previously with Tom Wright, did you come here with the idea that you were going to stay here?
I didn't really know. It seemed like it was a mid-sized school, and I had been to Kent. I knew that a school like University of Maryland didn't appeal to me. It's in Washington, D.C. suburbs,
Right.
and it's huge, and it was too much big city life for me. But a school size of Ball State seemed to be attractive. I guess I didn't have strong feelings that I'm only going to stay here 3 years and I'm
Okay.
going to be out of here. I
Okay.
didn't really have strong feelings. I thought if the climate was right, I probably would stay a
Okay.
while, but I didn't. I don't think I spent too much time really thinking.
Okay. How did you get involved then in departmental and university administration?
Well, I decided when there was an election coming up that I had always enjoyed, even as a juvenile, if I was in a club or an organization or something like that, I kind of liked committee work and trying to make sure that organization ran well. And that went from church groups to 4-H club to Grange, which is a rural type of organization.
Yeah.
And then in college, undergraduate school, fraternity and professional organizations in the department. And I was president of several things. And, so I did feel that I like to see things run well, and that's probably what inspired me more than anything else.
Okay.
And there was a time when I didn't beat out a former department head,
Right,
and
right.
there wasn't a big riff in the department or anything like that. He chose not to run again. I ran, and 2 or 3 other people ran against me. And, I won in 82. After that 3-year term, I was elected for 3 5-year terms until...
Until I ruined your life.
Yeah, yeah, until I got plucked out of that the job and sent upstairs.
Do you think, you're the one person I can ask because you've had all these responsibilities. So here goes. Do you think being a department chair is more difficult than being a dean?
Yes, I do. The workload is the difference. There are decisions. There are maybe more tough decisions, really difficult decisions, to be made by a dean. But the workload isn't as heavy. You tend to just be overwhelmed as a department chair with problems coming from everywhere.
Plus, you're supposed to teach.
Yeah, that's right. You're
Yeah.
supposed to teach, and from the students to faculty. And we did not have a faculty. The department I chaired was a very practical department with not too many wackos that make life just absolutely
Yeah.
miserable.
Yeah.
But there's enough other things, and the workload is heavy. The staff, that varies from one department to another, but you may not have as much staff help as you might have as a dean.
Okay. I made the point, you've heard me say it many times when we work together as provost and dean, that the department chair's job is the most difficult in any university setting. So you think that's
Yeah,
true?
Absolutely, I do. I think that there's more things that you can't control. You just have to deal with them. And they come from every direction.
As you reflect back on your time as chair and dean, tell me some of the things that you thought were the good things, the high points, and perhaps a couple that were in the category of more negative.
Well, I think for me, this is personal now.
Yeah,
This
sure.
was taking a department that needed to grow up. Let's put it that way. Up
Okay.
is important here. Grow up. We didn't need to grow in size. We needed to grow in maturity. We needed to grow in the way we make decisions. The department was very, from the time that I came, when Bill Sargent was here, was very democratic. Decisions were made by the faculty. The faculty was, because of numbers and background, sort of controlled by teacher ed, but we had developed some other programs.
Sure. Right.
And some of the people in those programs had been teacher ed. In fact, many of them had. But we were beginning to hire specialists. We were beginning to hire people who didn't really have, they had feelings that teacher ed shouldn't be running everything. I was a teacher ed background person, so I had to think that through carefully, but it was a thing that had to be done. It needed to be done.
Right.
Instead of making curriculum decisions about all programs in a general faculty meeting, we needed to get diversified and have faculties and have people that coordinate each program that had a vested interest in that program and make it the very best it could be. So I began to do that, and I used various techniques to do that. We needed to expand some programs, and that started with us receiving funding for a computer integrated manufacturing 2-year program. Was how it started out. That was pretty innocent. It was a
Sure.
pretty small program. It really blossomed, not in numbers on that program, but when we developed a 4-year program to sit sort of on top of that. And then we received funding over the objections of Purdue and over the objections of the Commission for Higher Ed. And I have to give Tad Perry full credit for him being able to get funding for that little 2-year program. And it was a stroke of genius on his part in what he did to get that funding. So we sort of were able to, at that time, Purdue was developing a concept of a statewide technology program.
Right.
And of course, we ended up with a 2-year program
Right.
on our campus. But they were trying to stall us off and not approve that program until Purdue got their act together to figure out how they were going to ask for the big bucks to make this
Right.
statewide with several locations around the state. So anyway, eventually we had freestanding programs, and we had overlap of courses, service courses for each other. We had a coordinator for the program, advisor for the coordinator / advisor for the program, which we needed. We needed to have, the programs weren't big enough for what one person could do the advising, and was able to kind of finesse that and get that to work. I guess another real, I thought a stroke of good luck, among other things, was being able to make some major changes in the programs and get them approved by the Commission for Higher Ed by the way we took them there, which was we took them as information items that we had retitled some programs and done some massaging. We actually got things the way we needed them, and it did not cost the university or the state any more money, but we were simply revising programs and making them into something else that was going to serve a better need. And so we ended up with a manufacturing engineering technology program, which you need a certain percentage of engineers on the faculty, which was a new thing for us. So that was another growing pain for some folks. It was fun for me. It was enjoyable to be able to see us really turn that into a full-fledged and then finally ABET accredited.
Right.
And we had the same accredited body and the same kind of accreditation for doing that. Engineering technology programs, and we also had engineering. So anyway, I guess those were some of the, I guess that would probably be long-term the major highlight of being able to take a department that was really past time to revise the way they were structured and get that department so that it was running various programs. And then, so we ended up with maybe 7 undergrad programs, some 2-year programs, and it's probably time for those to go by the wayside now with what's happening in Tech.
Yeah.
And the enrollments aren't that heavy. Of course, that's not anything that I'm that concerned about anymore. But the Family and Consumer Sciences was doing the same thing. They were following a little later, I think, with the way they were restructuring. But I got to be a part of that as a dean, where they have several strong undergraduate programs that are totally different from each other. Food management to fashion design to residential property management to teacher education.
Well, you really had the challenge, both as chair and as dean, of, as I would put it, helping departments reinvent themselves. They were one thing 25 years ago, but I think you and a lot of your colleagues realized that they couldn't be that as we neared the end of the 20th century and got on to the 21st century.
Yeah, and then that's happening again now, and I think I had something to do with not initiating it, but helping it move along, which was online courses and programs and nursing. I just can't believe that with all the complexities of a nursing education, that they've been able to do what they have, and they're now, I see U.S. News and World Report, that the second largest online nursing graduate program in the country, and only after University of Phoenix, which shouldn't count.
It shouldn't count.
That's right. So, and then all the online total programs at the university at this time, according to what I'm reading, are all out of our college. Let's see, physical education and industry and technology has a technology ed graduate program for teachers around the country, around the world. So,
think of, well, I guess I'd call it the big picture, not that departments and colleges aren't part of the big picture, but when you reflect back on your years of distinguished service at Ball State, what do you think are the most important changes that occurred during your tenure as faculty member, chair, and dean in the entire university?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. One is the Teachers College. It wasn't called Teachers College anymore when I came in '72, but a Teachers College growing up and becoming a real university. I think that Jim Cook had a lot to do with that. He was impatient and knew what he wanted to get done, and he moved it along faster than most people would have, much to the dismay of a lot of people. I felt that for the most part, Jim Cook did a great service to this university in moving us along and getting us into the mainstream of scholarly productivity, and then I think that President Worthen in doing some things, that one of them was very modest. I think one of the pushes that he made in his tenure here, which I feel I could talk quite a while about the things that he did for this university, but setting what at first sounds like a very modest goal. If I remember it right, you'd remember it better, so correct me if I'm wrong. Becoming one of the best teaching universities in the Midwest. And I thought, gee, that's pretty mundane. But there was a lot of follow-through, and we then had a lot of things to brag about within the next few years about how good we do these things. And it was happening at a time that the major universities were getting a black eye for what they weren't doing for undergraduate education. Right. In contrast, another school who I'll name since we're supposed to be frank here.
Yeah.
I can't remember the president's name, but you'll know it. Indiana State University.
Oh yeah, Landini.
Landini proclaimed at one point that they were going to become the Harvard of the Midwest.
Right.
And that's about the most, well, they haven't become that.
No,
so I guess
not,
it was not
even
close.
close.
So that was not that was way overstated what a university could do. But I think John Lennon knew what kind of steps could be taken to get us to the next level. And another one was the statement, and then working like crazy to back it to make sure it could happen, was having our graduates become technologically literate, computer literate in their field.
Yeah.
And then going about getting the money and getting what was needed in order to do that. And I don't know that it's every field at the university has become, but there was enough general pressure, I think, or maybe more than general pressure on departments to show how they were doing that. And I think those things have meant a lot to the university. Have considerable recognition.
Yeah, I think that the phrase we began to use a lot when we worked together was teacher -scholars /technology. And I think that sort of became the model, rather than, as some have said of Jim Cook, what he had to do was get us to the point where he could beat up on people and call it scholar-teacher, but that really wasn't such a great model for Ball State. The teacher-scholar was probably a little bit better balanced, and that's what I think you're talking about.
Right.
And then the slash mark I put in there is that we were able to get a lot of money from the state to add on this overlay of trying to make people technologically literate, or at least technologically aware, and that we left it up to the majors, the departments and colleges, to try to implement that, rather than putting in one universal course throughout the university that everybody would have to take. And I think that was a smart thing to do.
That was very smart, because it would have been basically a meaningless course. It couldn't have done much. And you couldn't steal enough hours away from majors and the other requirements to really.
Plus, I don't know where you would have gotten a faculty to teach that if you were going to do it with all majors and all colleges.
Yeah. But it put pressure on every faculty member,
Yeah.
well, nearly every
Yeah.
faculty member, probably, to consider what they should be.
Do you think there's some ways that in your time at Ball State where the university stayed the same? I mean, we've talked a lot about change here this morning. Do you think there's some areas where, gosh, when I came here in the early 70s and when I retired a few years ago, it was pretty much the same in this area? I'm fishing around for something here. But,
okay.
So I'll be glad to give you a hint if you want it.
Well, give me a hint, and I'll see if I agree with it. See if I agree with it.
Well, now that I'm toward the end of the set of 25 interviews that I want to do for the current academic year, a lot of people will talk during our time together about coming to a Ball State in the 60s and 70s that was a place where, in departments in particular, there was a feeling of camaraderie, there was a feeling of community, there was a closeness, and that a number of our colleagues feel that that is one of the things that's been lost. Others feel that it hasn't been lost. And so I guess since you're in numbers the 24th of the 25 interviews I'm doing, and you've had experience as a faculty member, chair, and dean, I mean, do you think that's true? Do you think Ball State is less of a community-oriented place, whether it's in a department or other areas that you're familiar with, than it was when you came?
I think it probably is less.
Okay.
And I don't know that that is. I think it's oftentimes not that much of a negative.
Okay.
I think that it's a matter of a good-sized higher education institution growing up, like I mentioned a minute ago.
Okay.
And in the case that I've elaborated on with the department, my department, having to really identify disciplines and hire people,
Right.
the right kind of people for those disciplines. Right. He lost us all being having similar backgrounds and having a lot in common, and maybe even enjoying different kinds of things in their off times. So I think I saw that. I saw it happening a little in our department, yeah. And I just thought, well, this is part of the growing pains of the department going the way it needed to go for the betterment of the students.
Becoming more of a university department? Is that
Yeah.
fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
so.
you mentioned the word student in there. Let's talk about that a little bit, because a number of my interviewees have said, well, at one point back there somewhere when they came here, there was more student orientation, student concern on the part of the faculty, and as we put in more rigorous requirements for attaining tenure, for being promoted to associate full professor, that the time that people used to spend with students has been eroded as a result of the fact that faculty come here now to know what they have to do to get tenure, to get promoted to associate professor in particular. And the faculty need to be concerned about that. Well, these interviewees would say, yes, but that takes away from the time, the free time, let us say, that they might have to sit around and talk to students.
Oh, I think it does.
Oh.
I think it does, and I think it. I don't know that is all bad either. It's
okay.
helping students get ready for life,
okay.
And
fair enough.
Things are not. In contrast, yeah. I think you can go too far. For instance, Bob Southey,
sure.
has two sons that graduated in engineering at Purdue.
Yeah.
He had to come back home and find a minister, find some other people to do letters of recommendation because no regular professors at Purdue knew him, in the case of the oldest son. And I don't think we've gotten nearly to that point.
Well, you're making my point, because for years, more when I was in the honors college and when I was provost, I used to say to students that when you sit there at commencement, and I know the letter of reference thing takes place long before that, but when you sit there at commencement and you look at your faculty colleagues, the relationships you've had with faculty, how many of those faculty know you well enough to write a really valid, honest appraisal of your work for them? And I used to kid people at IU about this, IU Bloomington, because they'd say, well, maybe one person, maybe nobody. Or maybe it was a TA or a teaching fellow or something like that, or a grad student. And I said, well, at Ball State, if you can't sit there at commencement and say, I know at least 4 or 5 faculty who have gotten to know me well enough to write a good, solid letter about me, then I think Ball State's failed.
Yeah, and I think we haven't failed, because I think most students
could do that.
Would, at least in the departments that I'm
yeah.
aware of, I think they would, if they're decent students at all, I think they'll have some people that know well to write letters.
Let me switch this a little bit. Have there been some people in your career, both here and elsewhere, who have had a particular impact on you? I mean, you mentioned Tom Wright. I would think Tom might be one of those individuals. Are there other people who, as you look back and you say, this person here or elsewhere really had some impact on you?
Well, the department head at Wilmington was a cranky old guy that most people couldn't stand, but he got things done. And I worked for him as a student and took a lot of classes from him. He certainly set me on the right track. I think I was motivated, but he really helped that. I mentioned the person at Kent who was very much into curriculum development, and I learned there very quickly that there was a lot more to be done in our field than just continuing to do what had been done. And then Dr. Donald Maley at the University of Maryland, who you may, I don't know whether you
How do you
ever
spell
met
that?
him,
How do you spell it?
M-A-L-E-Y.
M-A-L-E.
We had him here as a
Right.
distinguished
Right.
visitor,
Right.
visiting scholar about 2 or 3 times.
Right.
He's now deceased, but he probably had the most influence on me, and there's probably 100 other people or 200 in the country that would say that without question. And he was a motivating person, and he was always talked about the student. And,
Even though he was at a major research
oh
university.
yeah, and his curriculum development, his passion was to make was to do whatever you needed to do to develop the talents and strengths of every single student, and he could inspire you in his presentations. He was a former PT boat captain with Kennedy, never married. He was an amazing guy. So I think Tom was more up here. We were only a year apart in age, and I was very much, I guess, inspired by all that he could do. He started the Center for Implementing Technology Education, and brought in more money, income from projects than anybody else at the time. I don't know whether that's been surpassed now by anybody. Developing curriculum materials used all over the world, primarily the United States, but all over the world. Setting up a system to sell those, he just would take on anything like that. So I guess his organizational ability, very few people could imagine.
Tell me a little bit about any areas of particular interest that you had within the university. I know you've been on a lot of committees and things like that, but again, as you reflect back on your career here, were there particular areas at Ball State that were special to you? And it could be, you talked about curriculum development, so I think you put that, or I would put that on your list.
Yeah, that's probably.
But I mean, are there others that were especially important to you?
That's a good question. I guess the one thing that once I became a department chair, I guess even before I was a department chair, that I had some control over it, and that was the great grad assistant program that we had here in the Department of Industry and Technology. It had started in 1952, and with 1 and maybe 2 the second year, and it gotten up to 8 or 10, depending on how many Tom Wright could support with his site project. And he at times had, I think, 3 GAs. And we emphasized bringing in people from all over the country. And there was a department in the college that shall go unnamed that a department chair once said, I said, you know, do you have to spend a lot of time getting, candidates for your assistantships from around the country? Oh no, we just have a list of candidates from Ball State that are graduating that want to stay on another year. And in the middle of summer, we select them. Well, we spend money and time, and we had booths at every national convention every year, and to attract good people from all over the country who had different points of view, and that we thought we could help develop them into leaders. And it's just an amazing list. When you go back and look at those people, they have, their department heads, deans, provosts. I think there was one president of a smaller school in the country for a while, and now I think he's president of small schools, colleges organization in the state. So that was always a challenge, and it was something we kept a lot of pressure on to be able to continue to get people. It got harder and harder as we fewer graduates, and undergraduates coming out, and many of them had bills that they just couldn't afford to not take a job. Now it hurts the camaraderie and having these folks come in from all over the country and get to know each other and then make friends, for professional friends for life, and then you can't wait to get back to the next national conference to see them all. But the online program is helping a lot of those people who can't afford to come to get the degree from Ball State and take advantage of some of the I think I've gone astray from your question.
Well, that's okay. Well, it was areas in the university, but I also want to give you a chance to comment. Have there been any areas in the community that you have been working on or that were important to you?
Well, I think church is probably the only one that I really had time for.
Okay.
And I turned down a lot of opportunities in professional organizations because that's all voluntary and I'm being paid a reasonable salary to do what I was hired to do at Ball State. So I turned down a lot of those things, and the same thing in the community level. A lot of things that I didn't take on because I didn't really think I had time because I had a full-time job, day and night, and one full-time job. So I guess church would probably be the major one.
Okay. Let me switch this to another topic near and dear to our hearts when we were here as part of the university community, gainfully employed. Do you think during your years at Ball State that the faculty had the opportunities to have an appropriate amount of input into decision making?
I do. I think they had. There are certain people with certain personalities that never think they have enough.
Okay.
That they don't want anything to do with the unpleasant kind of decisions. There's certain things that they're interested in. I really think they do. I think the Senate system, while it's been beat up on several times in our careers here.
And recently.
Oh yeah.
Well, I think now there has been a move in the last couple of years to have more of a faculty Senate voice than a university Senate voice, and that's really what I'm getting at in this question, is to ask you if you feel the faculty would have been better served by having a separate faculty Senate than being part of the university Senate with administrators and students in it.
I don't think so personally, but
right.
I'm not a union-oriented person. I'll say that right up front.
Okay.
I think that I think our university is run quite smoothly the way it is, and there are always going to be some people unhappy, but I think they don't have any clue as to all the other complexities a lot of times that administrators are dealing with.
Yeah.
I think we've this is something before the interviews began that you mentioned something that I thought I wanted to bring out, and maybe it sort of relates to this question, and it's the fact that people are very unhappy with salaries here, and we've heard about salaries.
Well, you ought to read my interviews.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But
at least a lot of people, not all.
And it's, you hear the caustic remark, well, if you don't like it, leave.
Yeah.
And that's a quick and to the point response. But over the years, they don't leave.
Right.
And more leave now than did. But I think probably. But
that's kind of relative, I think.
And then the thing that sort of pointed this out was we had a team of creditors in here, and I think it was for AVAT. And they interviewed people all over the campus in different areas, and faculty members from the service areas that teach our math and science and that sort of thing. And they came back scratching their heads, and one did, and the others had gotten some similar experience. He said, well, people are really unhappy about their salaries, but they really love this university, and they've stayed here.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot more important things than money.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things being done right around here, and people like the community, like the atmosphere enough that they don't, a lot of them don't leave.
Okay. Well, you've given me a nice transition to my final formal question, and that is, reflect a little bit on how you see the relationship between the university and the Muncie community. Do you think it's better now than it was when you came here, perhaps worse? Your call.
Uh-huh. I think it might be a little better.
Okay.
I think that there's been more effort on the part of the university probably to interact and let the community know, and
Okay.
to involve people in the community.
Right.
You know, we had Emmons Auditorium, and
Right.
that was a nice sort of keystone. But it wasn't,
Emmons Community College Auditorium.
yeah, right. But I think that the university has tried to let people know through, and you see, I guess, more non-university people making some comment in letters to the editor about what would this town be like without Ball State University here. And we better be happy that they're here and what they do. So I would tend to think it's a little better. I don't know that it's hugely better, but I think it's probably.
Those are all the formal questions I have, but at the end of these, I always give my interviewees the opportunity to add any final comments, reflections, perhaps things that I've forgotten to ask that you want to record for posterity, or additional comments that you might want to make about anything pertaining to your long and distinguished career as a faculty member, department head at college.
Oh, wow. I think I've told you everything that I feel
Okay.
importance, but I really appreciated the fairly long-term stability of the university, which starts with the amount of time John Worthen's been here.
Right.
And the fact that he wasn't constantly running this way and that way, and changing his vision, fine-tuned visions.
Right.
And I think all the way down the line in administration, there was a comfort for a number of years that you knew there wasn't going to be a major change.
Right.
When I became a department head, we were going through the fair amount of turnover at the time. When was Jerry Anderson here? What year was that?
Let's see.
Was that before or after?
John Pruse came in the late 60s, lasted until the late 70s, and then, as you know, had a faculty Senate vote of no confidence, and he subsequently resigned. Anderson would have followed him into the very early 80s, and the interesting thing about Anderson, of course, is that he hired Cook because he fired Rich Burkhardt.
Right.
And so I often say to people...
And Bell.
No.
No.
He Bell was the business vice president. But the more important thing I feel in Ball State's history is that by calling for the resignation of Rich Burkhardt, who had been vice president for academic affairs forever, that Anderson opened the door for Jim Cook. And my view is that Jim Cook is the real revolutionary in the history of Ball State. Now, he couldn't have done what he did without the support of the president and the trustees, but it was basically Jim had a vision from an academic standpoint of what a real university ought to be. And the president and the trustees said, go get him, Jim. And as you well know, during that 4-year period, it seems like it was longer than that. But Jim was only provost for 4 years. And he basically turned this place upside down. Now, would those changes have occurred without Jim Cook? Well, in candor, they wouldn't have occurred with Rich Burkhardt. Maybe there would have been somebody else later on who would have been like Jim Cook. I mean, a real change agent, a person who had a sense of trying to transform the institution from the academic affairs standpoint. But Jerry Anderson simply wanted to have somebody different, and he's the person who created the provost position. And so during that period that Jim was here, he did a lot to push us in the direction of no longer being, as you say it, a teacher's college emerging university, to be more of a real university. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that that was a significant pattern.
And once we got that started, then
Yeah.
the stability that I'm talking about was allowed people to develop and allowed programs to develop, and there weren't the number of reports that had to be done, so I did it a different way, and
Yeah.
reports on top of
Sure.
reports, which you get when you have change in
Yeah.
top administration, and I suffered through that. First years I was
Right.
chair, and then it settled down, and you can really change.
Well, I don't think that we would have been able to implement what we did as provost, and in your case, dean, without having had somebody here like Jim Cook laying the groundwork.
Yeah.
I don't. I look back. I haven't really thought much about this, but I think to take on what Jim Cook took on, which is what I have come to call a kind of teacher's college mentality that sort of ruled this place, not a university mentality. I don't think I could have done that as a provost. I mean, maybe you could have as a dean, but I think you got to really set that at the top.
Right.
So that's why. I mean, sometimes people contradict me during these interviews and say, "Well, do you really think that Jim was that much of a revolutionary?" I said, "Well, he was, because Bob Bell saw the university as a former dean of the College of Business the same way Jim did. I mean, recall that when Bob was the business dean, he set in motion breaking the salary schedule. Not so much implementing standards for promotion and tenure. That was more J.D. Black when he came in to succeed Bob when Bob became vice president for business affairs. But you really had to have somebody who had an academic vision in the provost's office, like Jim did. And Jim did take prisoners, as you know.
Yeah.
And so he was willing to do what he did, because I think in some ways he thought he was going to be here for 4, 5, 6 years and move on to a presidency anyway. So he never came here with the idea of being in that position, say, as long as a Rich Burkhardt, or as it turned out, as long as I was in the position. And in my case, it had a lot to do with John Worthing. That John stayed, and as long as John was here, being provost was a pretty interesting job.
Yeah.
And so I never had any hesitation about, well, John wants to do this, then that, the deans thought that was a good idea. The majority of the chairs thought it was a good idea. The majority of the faculty thought it was a good idea. So I guess it's a good idea. So as a result, for about that 16-year period of John's presidency, 14 years of which I worked with him, we were able to get quite a bit done. Now, a lot of it has to do, as you look back now, on the fact there was a fair amount of money. I mean, what's hampering the university now is that there isn't a lot of money. It's a much tougher budget situation now than it was when you were the dean and I was the provost. So it's, and I know that you can do a lot if you have money.
Yeah. Right. But I think what you're saying about, Cook did a lot, but he got us on moving toward the scholarly productivity.
Yeah.
And I think you had a lot to do with kind of continuing to nurture and push that along.
Well, you couldn't stop.
Right. Yeah.
that was a snowball going downhill.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I believed in it,
Right.
and you believed in it, but you had to have somebody make the initial step.
Yeah.
Somebody had to fire the first shot.
He did the dirty work.
He did. He did the dirty work, and he fired the first shot, and he got people mad.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, we were able to carry forward an agenda that he had put in place. And I make no bones about telling him that every time I see him. I'm sure he did a lot at Montana and a lot at Old Dominion, but he sure as heck, in the brief period of time he was here, that he's a real change agent in the history of this institution. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think I'm not thinking of anything. It's been a great ride here at Ball State. It's a good match for me. I think in our family, and it grew as I grew, and that was I guess a little more comfortable than dropping into something that you have to grow a lot faster.
Well put. Well, thank you very much for being part of my study.
Okay.